Welcome, guys. Today, the objective is to analyze urbanization in the United States and the growth of cities. So, for your preview today in your notebook, I would like you to imagine that you are an immigrant in New York City and you are residing in New York City during the Industrial Revolution. And so, what you're going to do today is you're going to make a postcard and you're going to draw kind of a picture of the city of New York. It doesn't have to be the exact picture you see here, but something representing New York City to you, like the Statue of Liberty or something along those lines. This particular one shows the Brooklyn Bridge. And then you're going to write a short letter home describing what your life is like in your home country. So you're writing a letter back home to your family, wherever they came from, your home country. Pick a country that you came from, and you're going to describe your life, what kind of job you're doing, what's your home like, things like that. So you're basing this off of information that we've learned so far in this unit. Moving on to our notes here, if you have any questions about this preview, just come talk to me about it later. But as far as the notes go, in this particular lesson, we talked about the challenges of urbanization. So first of all, what brought people to the cities in the first place? And the fact is the cities of the United States of America had an abundance of jobs available to people, which is what drew people here to the cities. So the promise of industrial jobs drew people to American cities. And as a result, between 1870 and 1920, the urban population in the United States grew from 10 million people to 54 million people. Some of them were people relocating from the rural parts of the country into the cities, but most of it was immigrants coming from Europe, especially from Ireland, from Russia, from Germany, from Poland. So mostly European immigrants were coming into these cities seeking economic opportunities. And the cities were popular because you basically lived where you worked. So they were cheap and they were convenient places to live and to go to work. But these cities were not necessarily pleasant places to live. The cities were extremely overcrowded. They were extremely unsanitary. Back during this time period, the cities were built up very quickly without much concern for the necessary infrastructure within the cities to handle these larger populations. As a result, to afford their rents, people would often live in these very cramped apartments called tenements. So tenements were apartment buildings in New York City that would hold 2 or 3 families for a single family home. What's ironic about these tenements today is most of these are now homes in which only the extremely wealthy live in. So NFL football players, celebrities, stuff like that, they've since bought up these apartments and remodeled them, and now it's like the Manhattan Island in New York City has turned into basically a place for the rich and the famous, a giant gated community for the wealthy that tourists get to go to as well. Garbage pickup was also exceptionally rare because public utilities are lacking or they didn't simply have enough resources to handle it. So in industrial America, you have to picture these cities, primary forms of transportation for a lot of people, or at least the primary forms of transportation for moving things to stores and things like that, because the automobile was still an up-and-coming thing, was the horse. So you put all these horses on Manhattan Island in these cramped conditions. And what you have is this buildup of manure and waste in the streets. Sometimes horses would even die and their bodies would be left to rot in the middle of the streets, as you saw in the preview video. So the cities were unsanitary. Smoke from the factories, feces from horses. It was a very unpleasant, overcrowded place to live, which is a far contrast from what many major American cities are like today, in which they're pleasant places with great public transportation. Moving on, other issues would be little or no access to safe drinking water. Especially with the early construction, an issue would be that the water pressure could not make it up to the top of the building. And so the upper floors in the building would have inadequate water pressure. And actually the solution to that, as it turns out, and you can still see this in New York City today, was to put water barrels on top of every single building. And so the water would go up the building into the barrel would fill up, and then the water comes back down. And so what you're doing there is you're using gravity to your advantage to provide water to the entire building. And if you go to New York City today, you'll notice that on top of all the buildings are either boxes or you'll see the wooden barrel straight up, but usually the boxes have the wooden barrel inside of them. And supposedly, that's why if you go to New York City, you'll never have pizza or bread or bagels outside of New York City that taste as good as they do actually in the city. And that's supposedly because the water today in New York City that goes into these barrels, the wood in the barrels actually sweetens up the water and makes it taste better, supposedly. One thing is for sure that I do know from my experience in New York City when I visited is that they have the best tasting tap water you will ever have. Now, whether that's because the water comes fresh from upstate New York or because the barrels sweeten it up or some combination of both, I'm not sure. But I can attest to the fact that the water is absolutely delicious there. Other issues, pollution in the cities. As I mentioned before, horse manure was a big problem because horses were very common in the cities, much more common, obviously, than they are today, thanks to the mass production of the automobile. Poor sewage was an issue as well because the infrastructure was just simply lacking, and smoke from the factories. Crime's going to be a major issue. You have uh, all of these different cultural groups living together in these cramped conditions and living together in these very unpleasant conditions. And crime is going to be a natural side effect of what happens when you put people in desperate situations with high levels of poverty. In particular, alcoholism is going to be a major issue. So you look at the perspective of these industrial workers. They work 12 hours a day in a factory, and what they want to do to kind of get that off their mind is they go drink at the local pub or the local bar. They have too much to drink, and then they start getting rowdy or start getting into trouble. So crime related to alcoholism was a problem. Also, crime related to domestic abuse from alcoholism was also a problem. And I'm saying this because we're foreshadowing here the eventual passing of the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, the eventual movement to abolish alcohol in this country is based off of the issue that we had in which Americans had a very severe drinking problem during the industrial times, and it was mostly just a way of coping with the poor living conditions, but it was a huge issue. Now, as we're also going to learn later, the banning of alcohol is only going to make crime worse in this country. In reality, the main issues here were the poor living conditions, the high levels of poverty, the low wages, the overcramped apartments. That was the main factors leading to crime here in the United States, not the alcohol. But the alcohol was kind of a side effect and almost an instigator as well. Finally, fire is going to pose a big hazard as well. Because these cities are built up so quickly and because people don't always think long term, these buildings were mostly constructed out of wood. Sometimes the sidewalks are made out of wood. They're condensed together. And so fires are going to be huge issues in all the major cities across the country because you're in these cramped conditions. There's a lacking of infrastructure. There's a lacking of water access sometimes even. And the fire departments just simply don't have the resources or the manpower to stop a massive fire from breaking out sometimes. And so we're going to learn in a little bit about the Great Chicago Fire. And it was basically all the worst possible things that could have happened. High levels of drought, the fire department being tired from a previous fight are going to add up into this. Another example, too, the most deadly workplace incident in New York City history, and the single incident in which the most amount of people died in New York City up until 9/11 was the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire Factory, in which these women who are working in a factory in New York City died because the factory that they were in caught on fire and the elevators were not enough to get these women out, which is why now when you go to New York City, you'll notice that they have an infrastructure in which many of the buildings have some type of fire escape near the windows so that you can get down the edge of the building from the outside. That exists as a safety precaution in reaction to that. So fire is a major issue in the city. So once again, close conditions, poorly constructed buildings leads to these situations in which it's a very dangerous way of living for the people in the cities. All right, as far as urban solutions goes, things that made better for people in the cities and things that really make cities great places to live today, once people began thinking long term, they were able to create better conditions. So mass transit, listed up here, streetcars and electric subways. It allowed people to kind of spread out a little bit, to live into nicer parts of town. and to still be able to get to work. So mass transit, especially up in these old industrial cities in the United States, is pretty remarkable. Also, thinking long term as well, the construction of stone instead of wood seems like common sense. It's more expensive, but it prevents your building from being lit up on fire, and it prevents you from being sued, and it prevents you from having to build a whole other building as well. Also, a Christian outreach movement called the Social Gospel Movement. They preach salvation through service to the poor. So they provided outreach efforts to the poor in the urban communities, alternatives to getting drunk, I guess. And finally, settlement houses. They're going to provide cultural and educational and social services, basically ways of connecting immigrants who may feel alone with other people who are similar to them, providing opportunities for children, providing opportunities for workers, learning the English language, learning American cultural values, things like that. These are other aspects of the settlement houses. So they are very important for providing assistance to the poor in the urban areas and reducing the crime rate and things like that. Another thing not listed on here, but could also be considered an urban solution, is the invention of the automobile, or not so much the invention of it, but the mass production of it eventually by Henry Ford, because this eliminated the need for horses in urban spaces. And as ironic as it is, the car today is now considered, a threat to the environment because of the greenhouse gases that it places into the atmosphere, and because of the carbon it places into the atmosphere. Uh, Back then it was the environmentally friendly alternative because it didn't produce filth on the streets. So it's a little interesting when you think about it, but it ended up being an urban solution similar to mass transit. If you look at the difference between the Detroit metro area versus the New York City metro area, Detroit's more sprawled out, and what the automobile allowed people in Detroit to do was to once again sprawl out, feel less cramped within these cities. And then New York City, obviously, most of it was constructed prior to the major rise of the automobile, so it's more condensed, but the mass transit there is phenomenal. You can live in New York City and never need to own a car because the mass transit is so good. So these are the urban solutions to issues within the cities. All right, finally, we're going to watch a video on the Great Chicago Fire here of 1871. You can actually find it uploaded onto my YouTube page here, and you can watch it, and you're going to answer the following question. One, what factors contributed to the severity of the Great Chicago Fire of 1871? And then you're also going to tell me, do you believe that blaming Miss O'Leary's cow was a reasonable thing, or do you think this disaster was inevitable? So the legend here is that the cow started the fire, right? And it's a legend. We don't know for sure that that's what happened. But do you think it was justifiable that the Miss O'Leary became kind of infamous after that and was forced to leave because of the notoriety? Or do you think this is a larger problem, and explain why? All right. Thanks for tuning in.